My goal in this video is to explain all the content you need for the exam, and then your job is to try to remember it. So you might think, if you've already read the textbook, which is linked on Schoolbox, you might think, hey, I'm just explaining what's already in the textbook. Yep, exactly. That's what I'm doing. So if you feel like you've read the book and I call it a book. I don't know what else to call it. A pamphlet, the document. If you've read the content and you understand it, this video might not be that much help. But if you don't like to read and you'd rather see or also hear additional explanations, this is for you. So what we're looking at here is the content you need to know about animal experimentation for your Level 3 NCEA Psychology exam. Quickly review, there are 4 questions you're going to answer, or you need to be prepared to answer on the issue of animal experimentation. What's the issue? How's it shown in studies and theories? What are your thoughts on the issue? And how can it be addressed? All right, and there's a guideline so you can figure out the general amount of content you need to be able to know and take notes on in your preparation. Now, I would recommend using the rule of threes to answer all of those 4 questions, and let's look how we can do that. So, the issue, explain how animals are used, why they're used, and the limitations, the but. Okay, and the problem, and that will give you a full summary of the issue, and I'll show you an example in a moment. How is it shown in studies and theories? Choose 3. Look at 3 studies and theories. All right. What are your thoughts on the issue? Have 3 really well developed opinions that you want to present, at least 3. And how can it be addressed? The 3 R's. So the rule of threes is just such a great rule to use to structure so much in psychology. So I'd recommend it for each of these 4 questions. Let's begin with question 1. What is the issue? What is it? Right, here's the short answer. You must begin, I would recommend beginning question 1 with this simple sentence. The issue and the resource, which you're going to be given a resource, remember, like a cartoon strip or a brief summary or something. The issue is the use of animals in psychological research. Memorize that phrase and begin your answer. Identify that the issue is using animals in psychological research. But the longer answer that I recommend, and you might even get and achieve, you could even get 3 credits if you write this answer brilliantly, is explain how, why, but. All right, how they used. Right, so the animals used in psychology to help us understand human behavior. I haven't really included the how here. You might want to say something like they're used in experimental methods, right? Animal experiments. They conduct experiments. Here is the why. They conduct experiments because it would be impractical or unethical to conduct them on humans, right? We can't raise babies in cages and compare their brains. We can't, you wouldn't have people sign up to have parts of their brain removed. We can't inject humans with diseases and see how they respond. But here's the issue. That raises ethical problems, right? So the main ethical problem is it right to cause harm in the pursuit of knowledge for humans? And one of the major issues and one of the major question marks is animals can't give informed consent. And that's why they're also lumped in with children. Okay, so the actual issue is the use of animals and children in psychological research. In the exam, they typically separate out 1 resource on kids, 1 resource on animals. So how can you, is it right to experiment on someone or something that can't consent to being experimented on? That is the issue. That's the crux of the debate. All right. Now, you could just pause this here. I'm not going to read this out to you, but this is a summary of the first paragraph, how you would summarize the issue, how and why they're used, the actual issue itself with ethics, and then the counter-argument here, the but. Okay? So this is what I'm trying to give you here is some more content to have a fully explained answer. And what this is doing is showing your understanding of the issue, how and why, like the importance of animals in research, but why that brings up some ethical dilemmas. All right, let's get into the example studies and theories. Now, my main advice for this is to use those that you are already familiar with, that you've already learned in the course in year 12 and in year 13. All right, so there might be some here that you know about that I haven't included, like Martin Seligman's research on learned helplessness. If you've prepped other animal studies in the course, use those. Here are some examples, right? Behaviorism is a really good one to use. It's very relevant. And then we look at the brain, neuroplasticity and localization, and finally on attachment and Harlow's research because it stands out, okay? Behaviorism, you can begin with Pavlov. Pavlov was a biologist, not a psychologist. However, his work won the Nobel Prize for biology, and also it spawned behaviorism. Okay, and this was about classical conditioning. Now, if you can just, essentially behaviorism is about learning through association, or the study of psychology by looking at learning through behaviorism. Okay, so Pavlov, you can have a brief description. Remember that Pavlov, when he was studying the salivary glands of the dogs, he learned that actually they would start salivating even at the sound of the dish. And then he was like, wait, what if I give them the dish and ring a bell? Right? So then they associate food with that sound of the bell. Take away the food, just have the sound, they've got a learned behavior. That's what behaviorism is, a learned behavior. Here, there's no rewards or punishments, it's just associating a stimulus with a particular response. And you can generate that response without the original stimulus. That inspired Watson to then see, I wonder if this applies to humans. And then he wanted to demonstrate in his research, sorry, I don't know why these are changing. He wanted to demonstrate in his research that we can learn through, that's why. Fear is learned, not born. Right, and so that's why he came up with classical conditioning, and he applied it to the little Albert study. Remember, he taught little Albert to respond fearfully, like he would cry after he was shown things like a white rabbit and like a Santa mask, but then it was coupled with a loud banging noise. You can see lots of videos online about little Albert if you need to review it. Right, now some people have made the interesting point and observation that, well, didn't baby Albert have to have an innate fear of the loud smashing bar in order to have that to create that response in the first place? Shows a pretty big limitation with behaviorism, perhaps. All right, the fact that it actually does rely on some innate fear, hence it's not nature or nurture, it's both. Then Skinner was a student of Watson's, and he took classical conditioning and then developed operant conditioning, which is learning through association, but learning through association of behavior and reward. Meaning, if you do something and you get a reward for it, you're probably going to do that behavior more often. So he studied a lot of animals, pigeons and rats most importantly. He had the famous idea of where he wanted to train pigeons to drop bombs, so they could be trained to peck in the codes on the missile, so they would know the coordinates, and you wouldn't have to have people drop bombs manually. It's like maybe an early version of a drone, but funding stopped. He also famously tried to raise his daughter, I don't know to what extent and for how long, but raise her in a Skinner box, which was a box for babies where they would get all the kind of things they needed to be raised. Anyway, operant conditioning, Skinner used animals to demonstrate that you could create behavior by coupling the behavior with a reward. Now we get into, I'll come back to responses to behaviorism in a moment. Let's look at neuroplasticity. Remember, neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change as a result of experiences. That's suffering damage or our environment and even learning. So this is a famous study in the 70s which demonstrated that actually, based on your environmental upbringing, your brain's going to have the ability to change. Now, why were animals so important in this? Because we didn't have technology. We didn't have the MRI or the fMRI to go into human brains and study this on humans. That didn't happen until the 90s, late 80s, 90s. And so now we can use human studies and human participants to compare differences in brain structure. For example, there was a famous study in London that compared the taxi drivers with the bus drivers. And they found taxi drivers had different shaped hippocampuses compared to the bus drivers, because taxi drivers had to remember a lot more routes and information than bus drivers. But we couldn't do this back in the 70s. So these animal experiments were vital and really important in order for us to show neuroplasticity, to come up with this very valuable and groundbreaking concept in psychology that the brain is not fixed from birth, and it's not fixed because of genetics, but it is shaped by environment. So key. And so here we see what they did in this study was they had one rat by itself with enough food and water, but nothing else. And then in another condition, they had rats chosen from the same litter to control for genetics with a whole bunch of other rats and toys, and they gave them maze training and an enriched environment. And they weighed the brains, and they looked at the difference in the neural structures and the weights of the brains and the levels of neurotransmitters, and they found important, significant differences. That the brains of the rats in the enriched environment were more developed than those in the deprived environment. And studies on orphans out of Romania have shown this, that if you are a baby and you're raised in a very impoverished environment, then your brain will not be as developed as one in a more enriched environment. Then we look at localization of function. Okay, so animal experiments have also been really helpful in telling us about localization of function. The fact that different parts of the brain, that are localized parts of the brain, perform different functions. They have different jobs. What's this part? The amygdala. I hope you got that. Okay, that is responsible for emotion. And we know this from early animal experiments. Again, necessary before we had fMRIs. So what they typically do in these experiments is they take an experimental group of animals and they damage that part of the brain, or they might even take it out of the animal completely, like the amygdala. And in a different group, they don't do it, right? They don't do anything to the brains, or they might damage a different part of the brain. And then they compare. They look at the changes before and after. And any change in a particular behavior means that that behavior must be linked to that part of the brain. For example, if you remove the hippocampus out of rats and suddenly they've forgotten all their maze training, we can assume hippocampus is responsible for memory. Let's have a look. So in Weizkrantz study on the amygdala back in the 1950s, he actually followed up studies done in the 1800s. He had one group that they damaged, they lesioned their amygdala, and another group where they damaged a different part of the temporal lobe, because he wanted to see that they kind of knew if you take out the temporal lobe of a monkey, then their emotional responses, their emotional behavior will change. That was done in the 1880s, right? 150 years ago, almost 140 years ago. They wanted to see, is it the amygdala specifically? So they damaged the amygdala, a different part of the temporal lobe. The amygdala is in the temporal lobe, just so you know, and a control group. And what they found was that the lesion to the amygdala influenced the fear response, meaning they became tame. They lost all their fear of the humans, right? And another side effect I always remember from the study is that they ate their own poo. Kind of shows the issue, right? So does that mean that discerning what type of food to eat and figuring out feces from food is also part of the amygdala? We don't know. It's kind of a little bit messy, isn't it? So the conclusion there is that we figured out from that research that the amygdala plays a role in emotions. Later, after the MRI, we can find people, very rare, but we can find people with damage to their amygdala and then study their behavior. And they found a famous case of a woman called SM who, because of a genetic abnormality, has damage just in her amygdala, and she has no fear. She's not afraid of things. She's not afraid of snakes or spiders, even though she says she is, but she doesn't respond fearfully when she holds them. She's put herself in many life-threatening situations because she doesn't have a fear, so she'll walk home at dark streets and dark alleys, even though she knows it's dangerous. She's been in abusive relationships and doesn't show fear or learn from those. But yeah, we can only find that out now because of the MRI. But beforehand, before we had that technology, we couldn't. Just quickly, another study on cortisol and the hippocampus, again using animal experimentation. This is more to show us the effects of stress in damaging the brain, kind of showing neuroplasticity. That they had one group of monkeys, they put cortisol, and another they put cholesterol, and they found that cortisol shrinked the damage and created damage in the neurons compared to the cortisol group. Which what they found, what they knew from people with PTSD was that they had damage to their brain, they had damage to the hippocampus. So people with suffering PTSD had a smaller hippocampus. So they thought maybe the small hippocampus is the risk for PTSD. This study suggests that it's actually the stress from from the trauma that might have created cortisol, which shrunk their hippocampus. Again, that causal relationship can only be studied using animals. It'd be impractical and unethical to try to do that same experiment on humans. Hey, here, take these cortisol pills for 12 months and let's see what it does to your hippocampus. It might, it might shrink it, but do you want to sign up for that? No one's going to. So we do it on animals. But that raises the issue. Is that fair? Is that right to do that on animals? Kandel also won the Nobel Prize for biology with his research on aplysia, right? The California sea slug. These are really great to study neuroplasticity because they have exceptionally large neurons. And they only have 20,000, and they're so large you can actually extract them individually using tweezers, a microscope and tweezers. And then what they do is they use behaviorism, right? So classical conditioning to try to create a fear response in the aplysia. So this is really interesting. This is bringing together two fields of research. Kandel would touch this siphon with like a long needle and give an electric shock, okay? Because what that would do it would create a bigger fear response. That siphon that I think the aplysia uses to breathe or excrete water, or it's some sort of organ, that siphon will then contract and close up. And then if you touch it and electrocute it, and you do that again and again and again and again and again for classical conditioning, eventually you can just touch it with the needle and it will seize up. And therefore you've created a fear response, right? So the aplysia has learned something. That's really important, because then we can study the change in the aplesia's neurons to see what neurological change is underpinning that learning. Okay, so, and what they showed is, so this was revolutionary, because it showed that memories, which is learning, right? Your learning and your memories are facilitated and caused by changes to your brain, changes to your individual cells, your individual neurons, right? Again, only studyable, is that a word? Studyable, only able to be deduced by using animals. Finally, we get to attachment and Harlow. One thing that's really important to know is that most psychological theories and studies are in reaction to something already proposed in psychology. So, for example, Watson took Pavlov research a little bit further, and then Skinner took that further. Behaviorism became really massive, but then out of that grew the cognitive revolution, where people said, well, let's study the mind, because it's equally important to actions and observable behavior. And then Bandura, with his social learning theory, said, hey, it's not just about being learned by rewards and punishments and conditioning. It's actually, we can also just learn by observation. A lot of behaviorism was in response to Freud, and Harlow was in response to the behaviorists. The behaviorists argue that actually childhood attachment with the mother happens because when the baby is attached to the mother, it's rewarded with milk, food, nourishment. And so they're saying that that's all of parenting can come back to the importance of rewards and punishments. Harlow wanted to demonstrate by having the cloth mother and the wire mother that actually it's not just about children's behavior being shaped and the importance of attachment being shaped by rewards and punishments. There's actually something deeper going on there, like a maternal love, affection, contact. Like, it's not just about food, it's about affection or comfort. Right? I don't know. Affection is probably not the right word, but comfort would be a better one. Yes, my mad scientist brain just went off here, and I went, why can't they use real? Well, they used real mothers instead of taking the baby away from its mother. They could have used real mothers, but then stopped its ability to lactate, produce milk. Maybe that would be worse. Anyway, there's a range of studies and theories here you can talk about. Behaviorism, attachment, neuroplasticity, localization of function, to demonstrate your knowledge of how and why animals are used in psychological research. You could even go back through and look at your resilience stuff, the animal studies we looked at in the units on depression and resilience and stress. Right, how can we address the issue? Quite simply, the 3 R's. Reduce the number of animals, refine them so we create less stress and suffering, and replace the animals with other methods, right? So let's look at the reduce and the replace, okay? So there are 3 ways psychologists can reduce the use of animals by replacing them with other methods. And these are, we could use cell culture, meaning if you wanted to say, look at neuroplasticity, you can create cells, right, in the lab, artificial cells, and then go from there, right? So you don't actually have to damage the animal. You can just look at what's happening in the cell. You can use computer modeling. So if we'll have a look at that in a moment. Or you can share animals. Now this doesn't mean taking animals from one lab to another, but more likely sharing data. Okay. So brain tissue. So if you autopsy one animal for a study, then you can keep that on file and keep that on record, and keep your data as well, and then that can be shared across researchers. So you don't actually have to replicate the same experiments unnecessarily. Okay. So, for example, scientists can use human cell cultures to see how the body would metabolize drugs. So we don't actually have to put the drugs into the animals to see how it might work. We can actually do that in cells. Now, this is, perfectly honest, beyond my biological comprehension, my understanding at the moment. So I've got a link here in the textbook and in the slides where you'll be able to read more about cell culture. Computer models. Okay, so we can use computer modeling, so we can input the data into a computer, and then that can be used to make predictions. For example, maybe the effectiveness of a drug, or the ineffectiveness of a drug, and then so we now no longer need to use animals to demonstrate that. Refining, can we figure out ways that we can study animals that will create less harm and suffering? And one really fascinating example is the use of rats in an fMRI. This fMRI shows what happens when we activate their whiskers. Now, straight away, I'm already thinking, what's the generalizability to this? Humans don't have whiskers. What's the validity? This is probably early research in using rats in fMRIs. But what it's doing is it's a way of studying localization of function, how our brain operates when we're doing different things, without actually having to damage the brains of the animals. Big problem, though, is it has the same limitation as human fMRIs. Mainly it's time consuming and it's expensive and it's far more laborious, and also you could argue here, is this rat completely devoid of suffering? Like, in order to get it to sit still in an fMRI, you have to anesthetize it. It doesn't look like it's that much of a pleasant experience for the rat. Regardless, they are the three ways that we try to address the issue: reduce, replace, refine. Now, your opinion, I can't give you the content for which to write about your opinion, but I can give you some things to think about and then formulate your opinions based on that. Possible arguments for the use of research, and there's more written about these in the textbook. But justification: does the harm caused to the animals, is that outweighed by the suffering that it can reduce in humans? Okay, and I use this example again and again, right? If we could use animal studies to cure cancer in children, you don't want to know how many animals I'd be happy to see eliminated from the face of the planet so that no kids would ever get cancer again. Right? Now, of course, though, that's highly subjective and highly personal, right? Some people would say, well, no, that's not fair, and I probably changed my opinion after becoming a father. But we can think about it, right? So think about the advances we've made in, say, antidepressant treatments. Has that the ability to now use medications to reduce depression and anxiety is outweighed by the suffering to the animals. Counter argument to that is, actually, are depression and anxiety becoming reduced? Are SSRIs and drug therapy that much more effective? In fact, it's just recently been reported that maybe the serotonin is not linked and not a causal factor in depression at all. So maybe we've caused unnecessary harm and suffering under the guise of justification for decades. What about double standards? Okay, if you're going to say we can't use rats and cause harm in laboratory research, well then, shouldn't we ban all pest control? Shouldn't we ban all mouse traps and rat traps and shouldn't we put all those people out of, because we just kill them because they're a nuisance? So, but there's no benefit to that. It's just we don't want them in a house because they're a bit icky and yucky. What about food production? If we're going to say we can't, what's more ethical? To kill a chicken for a KFC burger, which arguably is contributing to the obesity epidemic, or to kill a rat to help understand the underlying causes of obesity to help perhaps reduce that? Now, with animal research has become really interesting with the breeding of pets. Animal research has become interesting because with genetics. So we can actually have genetic knockout mice, which means we can actually turn off and silence and even remove parts of their genome to the same way that would remove or damage parts of the brain, to then see what happens. And then if the behavior changes, we can make the assumption that that gene must be linked with that type of behavior that's changed. Okay? So you could say, well, are we playing God here? Is this ethical to be manipulating the genomes of animals? But what about the breeding of pets, right? So dog breeds, for example, and cat breeds have been selectively bred over generations to create these purebreds. So what's the difference? If we're going to accept pet breeding and animal breeding for even for farming, why can't we do genetic knockouts in psychology? Now, by the way, that article here, why this is from the BPS, the British Psychological Society. You can Google this article and it might give you some more notes and some more things to think about. Arguments against generalizability. Look, there's a big difference between a tiny mouse and me, an 80-something kilogram bloke. Can we really say what's happening in the brain of rats is the same as in the brain of people? And the generalizability means the extent to which the findings from one place can be applied and true in another. So in this case, we're looking at almost kind of like population population validity. Can animal research really be used to explain human behavior? Two major factors that influence generalizability are cognition and culture. Okay, for example, we can put rats on the we can put lasers on the amygdala of rats, flick them on, and the rat gets aggressive. But does that mean that the same thing would happen in humans? No. Why? Because of cognition and culture. I can think through the consequences of my actions. So suddenly, if someone flicks on my amygdala using a laser and my amygdala sparks up, I'm not going to immediately lash out at the next person I see because, well, I can think through the consequences of my actions. If they're a woman, I'd realize I'd be stigmatized, right? If they're bigger than me, I'd realize I might get hurt back, right? So, but rats might not have the ability, they don't have the same development in the prefrontal cortex to think through the consequences of their action. They don't have the same level of cognition than us, right? Our cognition can override our brain capacity, although some people would argue about that because they're saying that your cognition is only a result of your brain capacity. But anyway, the other factor that's different is culture. Our behavior is regulated by our social environment and our cultural environment. Rats, arguably, and animals don't have that same thing. So there's to what extent can we use the findings from animals relevant for us? Effectiveness, I just sort of introduced that counter argument before. We could say, well, that the suffering reduced based on what we've learned from experiments on animals justifies the harm. But has it really been that effective? Look in the Western world. Depression and anxiety on the rise. Obesity on the rise, right? Cardiovascular disease, I think, is on the rise. So what have we, attention spans, right? Decreasing. Is the psychological human experience improving? To what extent has the use of animals in research actually contributed to improving human flourishing? Debatable. Now, I said earlier, like, if we're going to outlaw research on animals, then we should outlaw farming and pest control. Now, there's a big difference, however, though, if you compare farming to psychological research. The argument would be farming is done quickly and arguably ethically because the animal doesn't endure any suffering. There's no long-term suffering, right? As people say, animals on a farm have a fantastic life except for one terrible day. So that would be the argument against, that kind of counter-argument against the argument that, if we're going to outlaw psychological research, we're going to we should outlaw farming. You can look at, the amount, I've tried to find it before, I've seen it once, it's hard to find, but you can find the graph that compares the amount of animals killed for human consumption compared to the amount of animals killed for psychological research, and the amount for consumption dramatically outweighs those for psychological research. So, if we're going to be consistent with this, well, how do we be consistent? Right. That's the content. My recommendation now, right? You've got this video, you've got the textbook, you've got the internet if you still need it. You know what questions are going to be asked. Now it's just a matter of time of reading, writing, studying, reading, reviewing, repetition, right? And then in the exam, repeating.